The beginning of 2011 was characterized by turmoil and turbulence in both Tunisia and Egypt. After 2 months of unrest and confrontations in Tunisia, the media announced news of President Zine al-Abidine Ben Ali's departure from Carthage Palace in the evening of the 14th of January 2011. Indeed, confrontations affected the capital, with protesters invading Happy Bourguiba Avenue in an attempt to break into the Ministry of the Interior's building. A month or so later, Egypt's Vice President Omar Suleiman appeared on TV to declare that President Hosni Mubarak had finally given in to the Egyptian mobs gathered nationwide and that he agreed to step down on February 11, 2011. But while disenchanted protesters were taking to the streets in many countries, Libya was busy attending to the task of improving Libyan citizens' living conditions, tapping into the oil boom and its return to the international community after a decade of isolation and sanctions, and after re-establishing its ties with the institutions and international powers. Libya, also thriving from cash surpluses produced by oil price spikes in 2007, 2008, 2009, entered into a phase of administrative, economic and structural reforms, making use of its great potential and accrued cash liquidity worth 150 billion Libyan dinars to implement ambitious projects in the areas of housing, health, infrastructure and education. Moreover, Libya shone at regional and international level, contributing in conflicts resolution through assistance provisions and the hosting of regional, continental and international meetings, conferences and seminars. Social networking sites in Libya and abroad have been many, and they called for demonstration and protest on the occasion of the memory of victims of Libyan police to demonstrators who tried to storm the consulate of Italy in Benghazi on February 17, 2006, which led to the deaths and injuries. And soon protest-driven demonstrations orchestrated by dozens of citizens in Benghazi and some eastern cities like Al-Baida and Tobruk escalated into all-out sit-ins and acts of violence targeting citizens and their property along with the state's facilities and premises. Demands for reform waned, paving the way for slogans asking for regime change, and the situation spiraled out of control, turning into armed disobedience. Police stations and security headquarters, courts, prosecution offices were attacked and burned, while prisoners and criminals were released. The rampage also targeted military barracks, weapon and ammunition warehouses, with security forces and army staff being killed and lynched in all eastern cities. Instructions were issued to all security forces to refrain from clashing with citizens and to evacuate their positions if necessary. I was part of Muammar Gaddafi's apparatus. I met with Public Security Minister Abdul Fattah Yunus, the Minister of Foreign Security, the Commander of the Popular Guards and Defense Minister, for whom the instructions were clearly made to absorb protesters' anger and abstain from recourse to force them whatever they did. As a result to an unprecedented malicious media propaganda and fact-distorting campaign staged by satellite channels like Al Jazeera and Al Arabiya, accompanied by inaction on part of Libya's officials, a series of condemnation and media-driven incitement campaign staged by Gulf and Arab institutions ensued, which led to the issuance of an Arab resolution freezing Libya's membership to the League of Arab States. However, Libya, which proposed to receive a fact-finding mission from the ALS and keep the matter strictly under the latter's auspices, was ignored and not consulted. Instead, the League of Arab States General Secretariat and Ministerial Council chose to refer the case of the Security Council asking for a no-fly zone resolution, paving the way for a military intervention.
I think we're all extremely...
We are terribly concerned about the ongoing events in Libya. 27 foreign ministers issued a statement yesterday expressing their concern. We have to see an end to violence immediately and the start of dialogue. The people of Libya and other peoples worldwide need to live in security. On February 24, 2011, the Security Council met in New York to discuss a draft resolution submitted by France and Great Britain asking for sanctions on Libya. Meanwhile, Libya's ambassador to the UN delivered a speech announcing his defection and his intention to join the endeavor of the Arabs in the West and the start of the effective implementation of the first stages of aggression. The Security Council issued Resolution 1970, which deemed that the large-scale and systematic attacks in Libya against civilians may amount to crimes against humanity, thus ensuring sanctions against Gaddafi and a number of his family members and statesmen. Then, on March 17, 2011, the Security Council issued its 1973 resolution providing for the protection of civilians and stipulating that all measures be taken for that purpose, including the imposition of no-fly zones and the execution of military strikes on targets that can pose a threat to civilians. France, Norway, Britain, America, UAE and Qatar have announced their readiness to carry out airstrikes against Libya. On March 19, 2011, operations led by the Arab and Western Alliance started and coalition raids poured in for a while until NATO took over command on operations. On March 19, 2011, operations led by Arab and Western Alliance started and coalition raids poured in for a while until NATO took over command of operations on March 31, 2011. Incursions continued in blatant disregard to any values and principles, destroying air bases, air defense gear, naval vessels stationed in the ports, civilian airports, communication centers, supply and medicine stores in Maya at Zawiya city. Houses, facilities and infrastructure had been demolished for over 8 months, during which the Western Arab coalition duly accomplished its mission to overthrow the Libyan army, to dismember the state and to deliver the cities one after the other to the armed gangs. Indeed, the International Criminal Court, a Western tool against the continent of Africa, issued an arrest warrant against Muammar Gaddafi, his son Saif al-Islam and Abdullah Snoussi on June 25, 2011, on the request of General Prosecutor Luis Moreno Ocampo. Hordes of armed men and gangs stormed the city of Tripoli, and a huge and exultant media coverage praising triumphant NATO rebels. In fact, what media celebrated were the rebels' takbirs as they euphorically lynched Libyan citizens' body, messed with their capital and security during the holy month of Ramadan. The world was busy watching the liberation of the deserted Al-Aziziyah camp, totally oblivious to the devastation that ensued. Gangs' entry into the city which kept its composure despite the tons of hurling explosives and bombs. Very soon, Tripoli became the scene of scattered dead bodies while the smell of death set in. The town of Beni Walid, stronghold of Werfella tribe, 180 kilometers from Tripoli to the southeast, was not spared either. The devastation sustained and the victims killed during the Western Atlantic bombing bear witness to the extent of allegiance this city manifests to Libya's legitimate leadership, even after Tripoli fell in the hands of the gangs. NATO's onslaught continued after the fall of Tripoli, the siege of Beni Walid and its bombardment with white phosphorus, when the city of Sirte soon loomed ahead as the next target of the gangs who cordoned off its entrance. The NATO-Arab bombing of the city gathered momentum, adding more devastation and turning Sirte into a large cemetery deserted by most of the living and deprived of all sources of life. The siege had lingered on over 2 months, during which the remainder of Sirte's citizens, soldiers and commanders valiantly and fiercely defended the city. وطوقتهم في منطقة ضيقة لا تتعدى We are sure about the presence of very important personalities inside Sirte. The Libyan people are expecting them to be killed or imprisoned. Ismail Salabi was absolutely no soothsayer, able to realize the presence of important leaders inside the besieged city, whose air, land, sea ports were locked. However, as a lord of the rebels' brigades, he was not short of intelligence pouring in from those brigades who were in cahoots with NATO aviation that defined objectives, outlined safe ways to reach them, bombed city gates, facilitated wiretapping for rebels, thus compromising leadership, communication and military units, especially after annihilation of all radar and telecommunication systems. Muammar Gaddafi was captured injured after the bombing of his convoy by NATO aviation near Sirte. He was tortured by Misrata gangs and was executed by the rebels, who transferred him to Misrata. The rebels and their leaders refused to bury the bodies of Muammar Gaddafi, his son Mu'tasim Billah, and the Minister of Defense Abu Bakr Yunus, and chose to detain the bodies in a meat refrigerator in a market in Misrata, in blatant breach of all religious laws and disregard for all the values, laws, and prisoners' rights. Gaddafi's dead body was laid in display for gloaters and mockers during 4 consecutive days. Concerning funeral ceremony and location of burial, stigma and shame will befall all the rebels and the international forces which supported them, knowing from the outset who the rebels were and what they were up to. As to the burial place of Gaddafi, his son, and his defense minister, it is still unknown. The adoption of the 1973 resolution, which provides for the protection of Libyan citizens, was just a legal peg to allow the Western and Arab forces and their followers to wipe out a country in the prime of development. So they destroyed what its children had built over decades, claiming the lives of thousands of civilian and military casualties by means of nasty incursions, whose number exceeded 25,000 from March 17, 2011, when Security Council Resolution 1973 was first issued until its termination on October 27, 2011. During the period of NATO intervention designed for the protection of civilians in Libya, for over 36 weeks, the number of the victims killed in Libya rose from almost 1,000 to 30,000, according to an estimate issued by Libya in November 2011. NATO issued a report on the air raids on Libya, estimated at 25,000, during which no civilian casualties were reported dead. As to civilian casualties killed, their number jumped from less than 200 victims during the beginning of the uprising to reach thousands after the fall of the regime, 200 of whom were civilians killed the night Tripoli was invaded by the rebels. Meanwhile, NATO air forces claimed the lives of thousands of civilians and military servicemen during the raids. NATO aviation spared neither women nor children and old men from killing dozens and hundreds of people in Sirte, Beni Walid, Sabha and Tripoli, and slaughtering entire families indiscriminately in the Souk al-Jum'a neighborhood on June 2011. In Sabha, dozens of women and children had fallen due to the outrageous raids launched by NATO aviation, targeting civilian sites with a view to terrorizing the population of the city, known for their allegiance to legitimacy. Not only does the footage of body bear witness to the accuracy of the NATO strikes, but it also reveals the high degree of humanitarianism which characterizes resolutions of international organizations and their concern about the real tragedy triggered by the 1973 decision on civilians in Libya. The raid on Major on August 8, 2011 was one of 8 raids staged by NATO aircraft targeting sites alleged to be military spots harboring army officers and Gaddafi brigades. The report on Human Rights Watch referred to this raid, which it said had claimed the lives of 43 civilians, all of whom killed inside the targeted housing complex. The residents of the area say that the complex housed Libyan families which escaped from the heavy bombardment in other regions in Slytten. The residents of the area say that the complex housed Libyan families which escaped from the heavy bombardment in other regions in Slytten, but NATO insists that the site was a legitimate target. Another raid targeted the Suq al-Jum'a neighborhood on June 2011, which is the only case recognized by NATO, which later claimed its missiles had gone astray, causing civilian victims. But Human Rights Watch says that NATO had to investigate those raids and to recognize responsibility for the fall of the civilians. So far, NATO has continued to stick to its position, declining responsibility for the killed and injured civilians of these attacks and refraining from conducting any investigations. This is absolute negation of transparency. NATO refuses to acknowledge responsibility and to conduct an investigation into abuses, invoking the absence of its staff on the ground who can be entrusted with the task.
Today we confirmed the decision taken by the North Atlantic Council a week ago. Our operation will end on the 31st of October. Until then, together with our partners, we will continue to monitor the situation. And if needed, we will continue to respond to threats to civilians. We have fully complied with the historic mandate of the United Nations to protect the people of Libya.
Rasmussen holds that NATO has fully committed to the terms of reference of its mandate, which consists in protecting civilians. But he would not deny that he had seen those pictures and those children. Or would he pretend that they were standing on the front lines, threatening other civilians, that his organization is committed to protecting? Our region has nothing to do with the military. We were displaced due to the successive bombardments and raids. My family members perished and my relatives left their home. Yet we were still targeted by the shelling. What if these children were Westerners? And what if those kids were British, American or French? What if those tragic events befell one of their spoiled pets in an American, French or British home? Which civilians was NATO keen on protecting? How old are you, Abu Ajila? I'm 12 years old. Where do you live? In Haniwa, a village in Sirte. NATO air forces bombed Arada neighborhood, leaving behind a trail of destruction and numerous victims in an effort to deal a serious blow to the spirit of the civilian citizens and push them to rise up. It is part of a plan designed to exert pressure on the people of Tripoli and its suburbs to come out against the legitimate state. But what is the nature of NATO's role in the conflict, and why did NATO insist on targeting locations free from any military appearance and representing no threat whatsoever to civilians? Hospitals are overwhelmed with victims as the need for more medicines, paramedics and ambulances to bring people from different neighborhoods of Tripoli grew bigger. Meanwhile, in Sirte, medics stood powerless as the number of the killed and wounded grew out of control, while Ibn Sina Hospital, which remained on duty until the last moment, could no longer provide the necessary health care after it had become the target of NATO aircraft raids and after a number of the hospital staff members came under attack by the rebels. The corridors teemed with the remains of dead bodies, corpses and wounded people, while morgues overstretched to the limit of their capacity ceased to accept any more bodies. Raids picked up momentum, houses collapsed, burying the inhabitants under the rubble, while civilians' resolve and resilience grew bigger despite the devastation. Film the flag, film the triumph, film the resilience. Citizens, along with civil defense teams, resort to augers and drilling tools to dig the victims out of the rubble. As a result, more victims whose only fault was to be caught in NATO's fire range. NATO has not yet accomplished its mission. It will not leave, nor will it stop until more civilians are murdered for the sake of their protection. NATO raids will not cease until they destroy the last house in Tripoli's neighborhoods, to ensure the safety and the comfort of children and civilians all over Libya. The girl Selma tried to commit suicide in the hospital to overcome the daily terror caused by the air raids that killed her relatives and left her all by herself. In Tripoli hospital, medics and doctors had no other choice but to gather everyone in the same area. So men mixed with women, a situation inconsistent with the Islamic religion and Libyan customs. Kids also found themselves with adults, and the living had to keep company to the dead. Thousands of people left their homes and found themselves in shelters outside their towns and cities. Children, women, the elderly, the sick were all displaced, deprived of the health care they so badly need. Schools and facilities were standing empty after being destroyed as part of the military objectives of NATO alliance. The international community promised Libyan citizens protection and freedom, only to deliver scenes of murder, blood, and the smell of death and rotten bodies throughout the country. And above all, the international community armed the gangs and led them to sweep the city once NATO aircrafts had demolished it from the top and destroyed every living creature inside of it. However, NATO keeps denying the targeting of civilians. So where did those people whose homes were destroyed go? Weren't they displaced and captured in their new locations? That is, in case they managed to survive the raids. Not only did NATO deny the killing of civilians, but it also doubted the killing of Gaddafi's youngest son and his 3 grandchildren during a night raid launched by NATO aircraft on Bab al-Aziziyah on May 1, 2011, claiming it had never targeted Muammar Gaddafi or his family personally. A site near the city of Bani Walid was bombed by NATO air forces. This citizen lost his wife and 2 sons, and he is trying to lodge a lawsuit in one of the Europe's courts of competence. I want reparation for my sons Mohammed and Mu'taz, and my wife, who is a teacher, who fell victims to this unfair raid. Weren't these people civilians? So who protects them from the oppression of NATO, which is supposed to protect civilians? But NATO refused to confirm or to deny the fall of these victims. And more questions are raised about the nature of NATO's mandate in Libya. What helped the NATO get away with condemnation is the absence of independent observers on the ground to document violations. Because civilians are not the only targets of NATO, its reports said that its aircrafts had dropped 3 American bombs weighing 1,000 pounds, 83 Mk type, and 5 missiles on the house of Dr. Khalid Huwaildi Hamidi on June 20, 2011. The raid claimed the life of his pregnant wife, Safa Ahmed Mahmoud, his daughter Khalida, 5 years old, his son Huwaildi, 3 years old, his niece Salam Muhammad Nouri, 6 years, his aunt Najia Hamidi, his cousin Muhammad, and others of his relatives and neighbors, as well as Arab citizens, Aisha Shlikh from Morocco and Bashir Ishaq from Sudan. In November 2011, Dr. Huwaildi filed a lawsuit at the number 11 chamber of the Belgian Criminal Court, which agreed to consider the case. Did Gaddafi target peaceful demonstrators? The opposition in Benghazi was armed and violent since the first day. It used firearms and petrol bombs, and also used trucks to run over those in charge of protecting military sites and to kill them in the first 3 days following the uprising. Security forces refrained from firing until the opposition resorted to violence. Security forces fired at the beginning with the only intent to injure but never to kill, with a view to containing violence. In the beginning of the events, the number of victims was overstated tenfold, announcing the death of 1,000 victims, whereas the actual number did not exceed 100. After security forces and the Libyan army had stepped in, cities of the east and west were restored, with no reports of any reprisals or abuses against civilians. During the first 2 months of the crisis, 257 victims fell, out of a total of 40,000 victims.
Use gunfire until the protesters themselves turned violent during those first 3 days. On the coast in the center of Libya, but that wasn't going
The North Atlantic Treaty Organization NATO intervened to protect civilians, targeted security forces in retreat, targeted security forces in area that supported Gaddafi and where civilians were supporters of Gaddafi and therefore not in danger of any attack by security forces. So why were security forces targeted? Provided intelligence, helped arm and train rebels, continued bombing Gaddafi's forces, although the rebels have repeatedly rejected offers of ceasefire. NATO should have interfered to discontinue the war and put an end to the suffering of civilians. Direct results of the intervention: reprisals by rebels who killed thousands of Gaddafi supporters, the detention and torture of thousands of military and civilian prisoners, the ethnic cleansing of blacks in the city of Torga, clashes between rival militias which include Islamic extremists for the control of cities and villages, the oil-rich eastern region threatened to secede. Human Rights Watch reports confirmed the continued crimes against humanity perpetrated by former rebels in Misrata, April 2012. Dr. Alan Cooperman, an associate professor of public affairs in Texas, United States, author of The Limits of Humanitarian Intervention, and co-author of the book Gambling on Humanitarian Intervention. We don't need an effort in Libya. So long as Gaddafi is not deliberately massacring civilians, so long as what he's doing is fighting rebels that are trying to overthrow him, then our interfering will probably make things worse, not better. The people who are going to suffer are the civilians who are caught in between rebel forces and Gaddafi security forces. The solution is to warn Gaddafi that the international community will intervene if he starts massacring his people, but intervention on the first day is unwise and a bad step. The difference is that in Egypt and Tunisia we had peaceful resistance movements, which don't provoke retaliation against civilians, whereas in Libya it is the case of an armed rebellion that defied the state from the first day. The second point is that in Tunisia and Egypt there was massive widespread support for regime change, but the situation differs in Libya, where Gaddafi enjoys massive support from the people. His supporters outnumber his opponents. Saif al-Islam's speech, his call to a peaceful solution, and his warning to his fellow Libyans of the imminence of internal conflict and the devastating loss of security, safety, and national wealth were not the last initiative of the state. In a speech marking the 34th anniversary of the proclamation of the power of the people, Gaddafi said that he did not have any power to give up, and that the power was in the hands of the Libyan people, who have the right to choose their government and their governors. He added that no one was able to exercise guardianship over the people or choose on their behalf. He said that there were no peaceful demonstrations in Benghazi and in the cities of the East, and that what happened was an assault on national gains. He called upon the United Nations to dispatch a fact-finding commission to establish truth on the ground of reality, and then he accused the extremist network of Al-Qaeda of being behind the turmoil that affected Libyan cities. The way people reacted to the unfolding events proved their support for the legitimate leadership of Gaddafi. The spontaneous demonstrations calling for an independent Libyan state, its territorial integrity, and the resistance of its leadership continued as people took to the streets of Libyan cities in spite of NATO's raids and bombing. We want to recover a free, defiant Libya and restore her sovereignty as it was in January 2011. We defy any assault supported by reactionary Arab forces. We want millions of people to march into the seized lands, march into these areas without arms, and regain your cities and security. Free your country from gangsters and colonial agents. Sirte, which gave the highest number of martyrs in the battles to free Libya from colonization, must stand at once for the defense of Libya, and the brothers of the East will be your support. The Awagir and Jawazi tribes will not accept that gangs keep Benghazi under control. Shame to those who brought colonization and indignity to Libya. While Russia continues its endeavors and Libya is unconditionally ready to find a solution, the NATO continues shelling Libya and destroying the country's military and civil infrastructure. NATO countries' leaders insist to be on the side of armed gangs waging psychological war on the Libyan people and their leaders. They invite them to their gatherings and give them political and media support. They generously provide them with financial support while depriving the Libyan people, children and the injured of food and medication. Although the Libyan state and leaders have accepted the African Union initiative after a visit of the Presidential Commission to Tripoli on April 10, 2011, the rebels in Benghazi hindered the initiative in order to make it fail. All this happened with the support and encouragement of Libya's friends, who hesitated even to allow the plane enter Libyan airspace controlled by their fighters. War has many faces. If NATO and its Arab allies have secured the political and diplomatic aspects and secured almost entirely boycott of the Libyan legal state, the battle required legal and judicial mobilization as Libya's enemy made of the International Court a platform to gather condemnations of the Libyan legal state and its leaders. This court has in the past been known for humiliating Africa and imprisoning its leaders, and became therefore close to settle disagreements with independent leaderships and opposing countries and among countries that have not even ratified its bylaws. After the court issued a memorandum to arrest both Muammar Gaddafi, his son Saif al-Islam, and Abdullah Snoussi for reasons that remain the subject of sarcasm among the international community, such as encouraging rape and the distribution of Viagra pills among the soldiers and volunteers. After these accusations were voiced by Susan Rice, USA's ambassador to the UN Security Council, they were repeated also by the International Human Rights Council, which was chaired by Libya. It was necessary to deploy pressure on the officials as the court's general attorney Maurice Okambo delivered a letter to Libya's Foreign Affairs Minister Abdulatil Abidi, which was a memorandum to all the Libyan leaders warning them of hiding the regime's and its troops' crimes. Then comes the UN Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon, who in a meeting of the Security Council on the 22nd of November 2011 denied that there was proof for Gaddafi's implication in crimes against Libya, calling countries to act wisely and not to get involved in accusations without clear evidence. As foreigners were leaving Libya, fearing the repercussions of the domestic fighting, the enemies of Libya's legitimate state realized it was a good occasion for which they mobilized the media and humanitarian organizations, which did not hesitate to go to the Libyan borders to warn the international community's consciousness about threats to refugees, ignoring the fate of over 5 million Libyan people who had remained in Libya. Qatar and the Emirates urged their organizations and other mercenaries to provoke a human crisis on the western borders with Tunisia at the level of the Hiba and Ras Jdir. The refugees' camps there became a stage for the intervention and the fabrication of stories, lies, reports and complaints. Shusha camp, which was located near Ras Jdir Gateway, was neglected as soon as the gateway fell under the control of the legitimate state. The camp was abandoned by rescue and humanitarian assistance organizations, which moved to another camp near Wazin, where media from all over the world gathered. A maximum of chaos around it was provoked in order to help with the flow of weapons to the cities and towns of Jbel Gharbi, Nalut, Zantan, Yafran. The camp soon became overtly a platform to supply weapons and fuel coming from the Gulf in a scandalous conspiracy and clear plot that led to the fall of the Wazin Gateway under the authority of terrorist gangs and NATO mercenaries. This group, which has become an international structure equivalent to international institutions, included those dreaming of free Libya oil and tax-free big contracts, as well as all those who were rejected by the legitimate leadership and deprived of privileges. The Friends of Libya group, which has been clowned lately for the fall of the Syrian state, excluded African countries supporting the African Union initiative from their meetings and invitations after Russia considered this group as an illegitimate structure. After that, they sent their military experts to train the groups of rebels and provide them with arms in order to improve their skills in fighting and destruction, as if these activities targeted aliens and not the Libyan people who were supposed to be under NATO protection, that is, the military arm for most of the Libyan Friends group. This group overtly discussed issues such as building the capacity of the armed groups, using frozen Libyan funds and providing them with weapons to be forwarded to the battlefront. They equally were used to fabricate lies about Russian supplies to Libya of T-92 tanks and Algerian imports of SUVs to equip the Libyan armed forces. Libya's enemies group equally represented a platform to forward warnings to the Libyan army and people to destroy them psychologically and urge them to surrender and abandon their leadership. I invite any Libyan officer or soldier to kill Muammar Gaddafi to rid the people of his evil. This is my fatwa to anyone willing to kill him. Qatar, Al Jazeera TV, Al-Qaradawi openly preached killing through a fatwa aired by Al Jazeera Live. This is the most involved trio in the conspiracy against Libya: economic, diplomatic, media and religious wars. One of the other faces preaching chaos and guiding gangs using satellites is the Egyptian military analyst and expert Safwat Zayat, who addressed and encouraged the rebels live on TV, unveiling to NATO the Libyan military strongholds and infrastructures. He visited the front as part of a complete circle. There are reports about Qatar arming Libyan rebels. What can you say about this? They have not asked weapons from us so far. Will you agree to that if they ask? If they ask for weapons, we will provide that. Will you send arms to them immediately? It will take some time, pending the necessary training to use the arms on the ground. Qatar's involvement in everything that happened in Libya raises many questions, and the means provided to the armed gangs in Libya imply more than insisting on providing Libyans with freedom and other achievements the Al Thani regime has not provided to their own country people. If there is a need to compare between Libya and Qatar, it should be in any area other than democracy and freedom. Thanks to campaigns carried out by Al Jazeera, the Libyans fought one another. Their cities were destroyed, and thanks to Al-Qaradawi's fatwas, the Libyans were displaced and divided into believers and infidels, East and West, Qaeda and seculars. Thanks to Qatar's weapons, Libyans killed other Libyans in one of the most terrible and destructive civil wars fueled by an alliance whose main profession became killing all the Libyans deliberately or not. If a revolution is required to establish democracy, would such a decision be taken outside the country to bring freedom on board fighters and warships with shells and the explosions of missiles? Why do Doha leaders deprive their own people of the blessings of freedom and go on supporting religious parties? Why do they deprive their citizens of that? The answer is given by Abdurrahman Shalgham, one of the Libyan sellouts, the first to voice his betrayal of his own country before the world, and the last likely to speak about Qatar, its practices, and obscure deals in Libya. We want genuine democracy in Libya, and no money from abroad to finance our elections. We do not want Libya to lose its decisional power and become accountable and indebted to foreign countries. Does it make sense for the decision of Libya, the rich and great country endowed with its history and dignity, to get in the hands of small states? Who do you mean by saying that Libya has become a dependent state? I mean Qatar. Who else? Why this attack on Qatar alone, although you advocated its role at the start of events in Libya? Yes, I did support Qatar's role. But suppose that your house was in fire and that someone came forward and helped you put down the blaze, then provided you with money to buy furniture. But when you entered your bedroom, you found him with your wife. How would you react? The problem is that Qatar is intent on humiliating Libyan people and generating discord among them by means of money. Other countries provided assistance to us without asking for anything in return. In a clear violation of the Security Council's decision of 1973, Qatari weapons flowed into Libya, exposing the lives of civilians to danger, in application of the ruler's secret and overt instructions to arm the gangs and provide them with training to oust the legitimate state. It is this same state that had refused to give him a 20% stake in the shares of a pipeline to transport gas to Europe across the Mediterranean. On May 31, 2012, the Qatari Crown Prince honored Qatari officers and military people who contributed to the assassination of Libyans and the destruction of Libya. He chose to obtain what he had wanted to obtain after destroying Libya, killing and displacing its people and women so that people of the Gulf countries can talk about their honor. We believe that France is still providing rebels with weapons. Today, some of the caught rebels acknowledged that the weapons seized in 2 boats were smuggled in coordination with the French and the NATO warships in the Mediterranean. It will not be the first or last time that Al Jazeera English language channel unintentionally says the truth as it unveils the presence of Western military on the front in the city of Misrata. Who is using mercenaries then? On the 14th of April 2011, the large circulation British newspaper The Guardian reveals that Libyan rebels received anti-tank missiles, which are assault weapons which have nothing to do with the protection of civilians. Qatar reveals that it had obtained the agreement of the British Foreign Minister William Hague and his colleagues foreign affairs ministers of the Libya Information Group. Journalists saw rebels in eastern Libya using Milan missiles for the first time.